For decades, the world had grown used to the image of an Africa being protected, assisted, and guided. Every time a crisis broke out, the world would say, "Wait, we'll send aid." But that aid never came in full, and when it did, it came wrapped in conditions longer than peace treaties. The people remained poor. The soldiers still fought with outdated weapons, and the reports kept promising stability. Then, one dusty Sahel morning, Burkina Faso broke the chains quietly but decisively. No permissions, no consensus, no signatures from Brussels or Washington. A shipment from the Norinco Group arrived self-propelled artillery, SR-5 rocket systems, and VN-22B armored vehicles. And as the first wheels rolled through the gates of the Ministry of Defense, the old order began to crack. This was not a weapons deal. It was a declaration written in steel and willpower. After years of waiting for an international solution, Burkina Faso chose to rewrite its own destiny. No one spoke to the press, no grand signing ceremony. But in that silence, the world heard the fracture of a long-standing power structure. A small nation had acted out its truth. We no longer fight with borrowed strength. We fight with the faith that is ours. In Brussels, they called it a democratic setback. In Washington, a strategic mistake. But across Africa and villages stripped of peace by endless wars, it was the first real spark of hope. Because perhaps, for the first time in decades, an African nation wasn't waiting for a miracle. It had become the miracle. From that moment on, the geopolitical balance refused to stay still. Every armored vehicle rolling through the streets of Ouagadougou carried not just weapons, but a message engraved in steel. Africa has options. And when a continent long dictated to finally realizes it has a choice, the entire world must learn a new way to speak to it. This is not a story about war. It's a story about awakening, about the moment a people stop waiting to be saved and begin saving themselves. Because when a continent no longer asks permission to be strong, it's not just a military shift, it's a revolution in the human spirit. Burkina Faso did what no one expected. It shattered the old order without a single explosion. A quiet pivot, yet powerful enough to make the world pause in unease. And now the question is, was this merely a strategic transaction or the dawn of Africa's rebirth? The answer lies out there, in the desert, where the new treads of steel have just marked the sand. When the last convoy halted inside the base on the outskirts of Ouagadougou, the red dust still hung in the air. Young soldiers, most of them had never seen modern military technology before, stood silently, watching the gleaming armored hulls reflect the African Sunday. They didn't cheer. They didn't raise their rifles. They just stood still, as if witnessing something beyond war. For the first time, they felt respected, because what Burkina Faso received was not merely weapons. It was the language of equality. No lectures about democracy. No demands for reform. No memorandums forcing them to rewrite their constitution or cut social spending. Only one clause: cooperation by agreement, respect for sovereignty. A simple line, yet it carried the weight of half a century of history. In the cold offices of Paris and Washington, they called it Chinese influence. But in Ouagadougou, they called it a chance to survive. When Western aid withdrew, when soldiers had to reuse old rounds, when villages across the Sahel vanished from the map, the only thing left to believe in was action. And in a world where promises have lost their value, an armored vehicle delivered on time was worth more than 1,000 speeches. Traoré understood that difference. In a closed meeting at the presidential palace, he told his officers, "People don't respect us because we're poor or rich. They respect us when they know we can defend ourselves." That sentence rang out like a declaration of an entire generation. A generation tired of being lectured, yet never tired of hope. Each cannon, each missile system was more than a tool. They were symbols of self-determination. Burkina Faso did not buy weapons to start wars, but to end the feeling of dependency. Not to prove strength, but to prove the right to stand on its own. To many, it was just an equation of steel and money. But to the people of the Sahel, it was the equation of steel and faith, faith that they no longer had to bow their heads just to survive. As the Norinco vehicles rumbled through the villages, children stopped playing, and the elders looked up, not out of curiosity, but because they sensed something different in the sound of the future. From that moment on, Ouagadougou was no longer just a place of delivery. It became the place of oath where a growing Africa declared itself. No longer waiting for a protective hand from outside. No longer waiting for promises of salvation, because after too many years of hearing, "Wait for us," Burkina Faso finally said to itself, "We have waited long enough." And from those words, a new chapter of the continent began, not written in blood, but in will. News from Ouagadougou spread faster than any diplomat had predicted. Within hours, photos of the Norinco convoys appeared on Reuters, CNN, and Le Monde. The headlines were cold but tinged with unease. Burkina Faso changes strategic supplier. China expands its influence in the Sahel. Yet beneath those neutral words, something far deeper was unfolding, not a shift in contracts, but a shift in faith. In Brussels, security advisors held emergency meetings. Behind glowing screens, they debated whether this was a Beijing intervention. In Paris, the foreign ministry issued a statement expressing deep concern. And in Washington, a general murmured during a closed briefing, "We've just lost another country without firing a single shot." But they forgot one truth. It was they who made Africa walk away in silence. With conditional aid programs, with moral lectures tied to sanctions, with the habit of sending advisors instead of tools, reports instead of solutions. For 2 decades, Western stabilization missions in the Sahel had drained billions of dollars, yet not a single farmer felt safer. Villages were abandoned, schools crumbled, and every international conference ended with the same weary phrase: "We just need more time." Time, the one thing the people of Burkina Faso no longer had. And when the West withdrew, China said nothing. No slogans, no promises of humanitarian help, only heavy containers and short contracts. That was the difference. One side spoke of values, the other delivered capability. To Ibrahim Traoré, this was not betrayal. It was the inevitable result of exhaustion. He once said in a private speech, "We don't need to be loved, we need to be respected." And in that moment, he spoke for an entire continent. The West had grown used to seeing Africa as the obedient pupil, listening, signing, waiting for approval. But the new generation of leaders no longer wanted to study. They wanted to write their own curriculum. When Burkina Faso signed with China, it wasn't a punch to anyone's face. It was the fist on the table of a people who had been silent for too long. A small sound in the desert, yet enough to make the walls of Europe tremble. Analysts now call it post-Western Africa, a continent not rebelling against the West, but moving beyond it. They aren't seeking confrontation, they are seeking autonomy. And that is what terrifies the old centers of power. Because when a slave no longer hates his master, but simply no longer needs him, every empire knows its time is ending. Burkina Faso was only the first flash of lightning. Then came Niger, Mali, and soon others who had lived quietly in the shadows began to ask, if they can do it, why can't we? The old order didn't fall in an explosion. It crumbled piece by piece, undone by the awakening of those once considered weak. The West didn't lose Africa in a day. It lost it in every promise it failed to keep. And in Ouagadougou, under the desert winds of the night, people say that sometimes a convoy can weigh more than a revolution. Because in the rumble of those engines, Africa didn't just hear the sound of steel, it heard its own heartbeat returning. In the weeks that followed, the political map of West Africa began to change. No longer lines of separation, but lines of connection. Across the sandstorms of Gao, Niamey, and Ouagadougou, 3 young leaders, Ibrahim Traoré, Assimi Goïta, and Abdourahmane Tiani, sat around an old wooden table. No flags, no reporters, just a single handwritten sheet bearing 6 words. Alliance des États du Sahel AES. None of them called it a military alliance. They called it a pact of survival. After years of fighting alone, each nation understood that if the Sahel fell, all of Africa would tremble. And so, from the ashes of broken treaties, the Alliance of Sahel States was born. From the outside, AES looked like a defensive pact. But inside, it was something deeper, a new philosophy of power. No more appealing to the West for protection. No more foreign advisors standing over the war maps. They would train themselves, coordinate themselves, share their own intelligence. For the first time, the nations once labeled danger zones were rewriting the rules of regional security. Burkina Faso took the lead not because it was the richest, but because it had the clearest will. The SR-5 rocket systems and VN-22B artillery no longer guarded only Burkina's borders. They now stood ready to defend Mali and Niger if either were attacked. A shared arsenal began to form, and with it, a new spirit. If they strike one of us, they face all of us. The West looked at AES with suspicion. calling it an alliance of dictatorships. But to the people of the Sahel, it was an alliance of dignity. A treaty not signed in Brussels, but written in the blood and sand of the Sahara. A declaration that Africans could protect one another without anyone standing in between. The emergence of AES marked the birth of a new doctrine for Africa, the doctrine of active sovereignty, not based on charity, but on capability and solidarity. The Sahel leaders understood aid is not a strategy, it's a leash wrapped in the language of help. If they wanted freedom, they had to build their own infrastructure, their own logistics, their own trust. In a private address to his commanders, Traoré said, "We did not form this alliance to wage war. We formed it so no one will ever again think they can teach us how to live." Those words spread from camp to camp, carried on the red winds across the borders. And within months, the first joint operations began. No natologos, no EU observers. Only 3 national flags fluttering in the same direction. At sunset, as the convoys rolled across the desert, soldiers from Burkina and Mali looked at one another not as strangers, but with the recognition that they were no longer alone. From that moment, the Sahel was no longer the edge of the world. It became the laboratory of a new Africa, where principles are rewritten, and where independence finally means more than a slogan. AES does not only defend against bullets, it defends against the mindset of dependence that has haunted generations. And if they can hold on to that spirit, then perhaps for the first time in centuries, Africa will not merely survive. It will begin to define itself. As dawn swept across the northern base of Kaya, the new artillery of Burkina Faso stood in perfect formation. Each gun barrel still carried the red dust of the desert, the same dust that had witnessed generations of warriors fall. But this time, in the soldiers' eyes, there was no fear. There was confidence. There was the quiet certainty that though poor and small, they could at last defend their own land. Yet power always carries temptation. Those cannons, if aimed the wrong way, could destroy the very thing they were meant to protect, the people's trust. Ibrahim Traoré knew this well. In a midnight meeting with his commanders, he said, "We cannot let steel become stronger than the heart. If the army forgets that the people are the reason we fight, then even if we win every battle, we still lose ourselves." That sentence became the moral compass of the new army, because African history had already shown what happens when power outgrows conscience. Many nations had gained weapons but lost their souls. When strength goes unchecked, it turns liberators into oppressors. Burkina Faso could not repeat that mistake. It could not let its revolution drift away from its moral orbit. The first test came sooner than expected. A rebel attack on the northern border killed dozens of civilians. The army launched a sweeping counter-offensive, but a single misjudgment, one village mistaken for a rebel base, nearly shattered everything. Traoré immediately ordered the operation suspended and personally met the victims' families. "No freedom can be built on the silence of the innocent," he said. In that moment, people saw not just a president, but a soldier who understood the value of a human life. The world watched closely. The West waited for the first mistake to condemn, while the people of the Sahel waited for proof that power need not erase compassion. Traoré chose the hardest path to defend victory through ethics. He created the Sahel Military Ethics Committee, an independent body made up of clerics, village elders, and veterans. They held no command, but had the right to question any officer who showed signs of abuse. Because true victory isn't measured by how many enemies are killed, but by how many lives are protected. And within every Sahel soldier now echoed a quiet reminder. Our enemy is not only beyond the border, but within the heart where arrogance takes root. Step by step, Burkina Faso was learning to turn strength into responsibility. No longer just an army that fought, but one that could think, restrain itself, and stand steady on the thin line between morality and power. For in this new era, the strongest are not those with the most guns, but those who know when not to pull the trigger. That is Africa's greatest challenge today. A continent rediscovering its voice must also learn not to shout in triumph. Awakening means nothing without wisdom and compassion. Now, as the AES flags flutter in the wind, the question is no longer, do they have enough weapons? But rather, do they have enough strength to keep their soul? And the answer lies in every African who walks this path, because the future of the continent will not be decided in conferences, but in the hearts that still believe freedom cannot coexist with indifference. If you too believe that true power is self-mastery, share the story. Let the world see that Africa is rising not only through steel, but through spirit, dignity, and maturity. And if you wish to walk alongside this rebirth, you subscribe to the journey, for every voice that joins is a brick in the foundation of Africa's true freedom. As the dust from the first campaign settled, one truth became clear. The transformation of Burkina Faso was no longer an internal affair. It had become an experiment for an entire continent. News of the AES alliance and its autonomous army swept across Africa. From Lagos to Addis Ababa, from Dakar to Kinshasa, young people began to speak of the Sahel model, a new idea replacing the old textbooks of development and aid. This doctrine wasn't written in Western think tanks. It was born in smoke and sand, where every decision was made not by theory, but by the instinct to survive. Its first principle was simple. No one will protect you except yourself. After centuries of waiting for rescue, Africa was awakening to a truth: freedom cannot be given. It must be built. At regional conferences, the old vocabulary began to fade. Peer cooperation replaced development aid. Local capacity replaced technology transfer. And at the heart of this new language stood a powerful phrase: collective self-reliance. No nation wanted to remain the obedient student in the classroom of the world. Every country, no matter how small, had the right to redefine how it exists. That shift reached even the young intelligentsia. At the universities of Ouagadougou, students studied parallel economies models built not on foreign loans, but on regional exchange. In Bamako, young journalists founded Nouvelle Souveraineté, writing about ownership of resources and information. And in Niamey, a team of young engineers began designing solar systems for AES border posts, a symbol of the belief that technology, too, can have an African passport. What made this doctrine different was not its weapons or treaties, but its philosophy of worth. For generations, Africans were taught that civilization meant imitation. But now they understood. Civilization is not copying the strong, it's nurturing what is right. They didn't need to shout their defiance. They chose to assert themselves quietly through work, through results, through perseverance. Yet every awakening comes with a price. As Sahel nations built independent networks, Western capital began to withdraw. Development funds were cut, humanitarian aid delayed. International media changed tone, branding these governments undemocratic, uncooperative, pro-China. But in that isolation, they found a purer kind of freedom, no longer indebted, no longer bound by distant promises. In the heart of Ouagadougou, a new sign was raised in front of the Ministry of Defense, written in Mooré and French. La dignité n'a pas de sponsor. Dignity has no sponsor. That phrase became the motto of a new era, and like a domino effect, its spirit spread beyond the Sahel. South Africa began reassessing its mining agreements. The Democratic Republic of Congo launched oversight campaigns on cobalt exports. Across the Atlantic, Western analysts looked on in disbelief, realizing that Africa no longer needed them to talk about the future. Africa was now speaking for itself. The world remains skeptical, but the truth is undeniable. Once a people discover they can stand without being held, they will never kneel again. That is what is unfolding across the Sahel, where the steel has cooled, but the will has never faded. Africa's new doctrine is not a declaration of war. It is a reminder: respect is not a privilege, it is a birthright. From Burkina Faso, a quiet message now echoes, not through United Nations podiums, but through small, steadfast actions. A continent once dismissed as the world's shadow is becoming the torch that lights the way back to our shared humanity. In the summer of 2026, an international summit was held in Geneva. Its theme: redefining global cooperation. Delegates from dozens of nations attended, but every eye turned toward one name: Burkina Faso. For the first time, a country once considered a geopolitical outsider sat at the center of the round table, not as a recipient of aid, but as an equal partner. When Ibrahim Traoré stepped up to the podium, the room fell silent. He wore a simple military uniform, no medals, only the insignia of the AES on his chest. "We did not come here to complain," he began, his voice steady and measured. "We came to remind the world that Africa does not need to be taught how to live it, only needs to be heard." The words cut cleanly through the polished language of diplomacy. Some diplomats frowned, others lowered their eyes to their notes. But in the back row, an African journalist smiled. He knew this was the moment history had been waiting for. Traoré's speech carried no tone of defiance. It was a manifesto of maturity. He spoke of how Burkina Faso had built its own energy infrastructure using regional capital, of new civic defense education programs where children were taught to love their country, not fear their enemies, of how AES was evolving into a Sahel economic community where resources were shared and no longer dictated by outsiders. "We do not wish to separate from the world," he concluded. "We simply wish to take part in it as equals." When he stepped down, the applause began hesitantly, then grew louder, stronger. Not everyone agreed with him, but no one could deny it. The old order was shaking. In Paris, headlines mixed surprise with caution. "The Sahel demands the right to redefine global cooperation." In Washington, security advisors pored over new data seeking ways to rebalance strategy in Africa. But what they failed to see was that the rules of the game had already changed. Once Africa began to speak in its own voice, the language of power itself had to evolve. Soon, the signs were undeniable. At global economic forums, AES delegates were seated beside G20 members. New mining contracts required 50/50 profit sharing. And in many negotiations, it was now the African nations setting the terms. The world began to listen, but not out of goodwill. It listened because it had to. Niger's uranium, Burkina's gold, Chad's oil, and the Sahel's new trade corridors together formed a resource belt capable of shifting the global energy balance. A continent once dismissed as a warehouse had become the keeper of the keys. Yet amid the growing attention, Traoré's tone remained calm. He knew that power, without principle, was fragile. "Once they listened because we were weak," he said in a private address. "Now they listen because we are strong. But one day they must listen because they respect us. That will be our final victory." In those words lay something greater than politics, a profoundly human aspiration. The desire to be recognized, not for might, but for dignity. And when the lights of Geneva dimmed, the world understood. A new chapter had begun. No longer the West and the rest, but a world where every voice carries weight. In that brief, quiet moment, the planet seemed to hear from deep within the Sahel the steady, powerful heartbeat of Africa. Independent, unwavering, and finally its own. A year after the Geneva speech, Ouagadougou was transformed. The streets once choked with dust now bloomed with banners, not of leaders, but of students, farmers, and engineers. Because Burkina Faso no longer spoke about power, it spoke about the future. In the northern plains, solar panels designed by young AES engineers gleamed beneath the sunday. In the east, women took their seats on local councils managing natural resources. And in the capital, the Sahel School of Autonomy and Development opened its doors, training a new generation of African leaders, taught that sovereignty is not just a border, but a state of mind. The world looked back and was astonished. No one had imagined that a nation once listed among the poorest in the world could become a symbol of political maturity and national pride. The miracle was not in their weapons, but in how they wielded power, with discipline, restraint, and philosophy. Traoré was not building an empire, he was building an ideology, a doctrine of freedom bound by responsibility. From the Sahel, that spirit spread outward. In Ethiopia, young people launched a movement called African Recalibration, a call to redefine the continent. In Jamaica, the Roots of Dignity initiative drew inspiration from Burkina Faso to champion cultural independence. And at the United Nations, African delegations presented for the first time a declaration on information sovereignty, demanding control over their own data. A continent once forced to learn from the world was now teaching the world the meaning of dignity. Yet the deepest legacy Burkina Faso left behind was not strength, it was a reminder of its limits. For in every age, the truly powerful are not those who dominate, but those who stop at the edge of justice. That is what made the Sahel revolution different. It built no temples to power, but to responsibility. When night fell over the desert, they said Traoré would often walk alone around the camp, no guards, no convoy. He would gaze at the new lights flickering across lands that had once been darkness. A young officer once overheard him whisper, "This is not the light of Burkina. It is the light of a continent learning to illuminate itself." Now, Africa is no longer a place to be pitied, but a place to be learned from. A continent once taught to be humble now teaches the world what true humility means, to stand tall without stepping on anyone. If you are hearing these words, remember this. Freedom is not born from promises, but from action. And change does not begin with a nation, it begins with awareness. Africa achieved it because it dared to believe that dignity does not need permission, only protection. Share this story. For every time it is told, the torch of the Sahel burns a little brighter, because the world truly changes only when we stop fearing the light and when the belief in freedom is no longer a dream, but a deed. ChatGPT có thể mắc lỗi. Hãy kiểm tra các thông tin quan trọng.